Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, Florida State, kicking off fall camp. And look, I get it's early. You're already starting to hear some positive feedback, not only about some of the new faces on this Florida State roster, but also some of the young talent on this roster as well. Guys that we think Florida State needs to hit with going into 2025. We'll get nitty gritty, talk about the players that are generating some buzz, talk about what it means for Florida State going into 2025. I want to start with a little bit of an overarching take around this program rolling into the 2025 year. And that is, did we do a better job not only grabbing better football players in the transfer portal, but better teammates as well? And what I mean by that is look at how Deuce Robinson is not only talking to the media, but how he's getting talked about from people within the program. Same thing for a guy like Luke Pettibon. Same thing for a guy like Jeremiah Wilson. And then you compare that to what we heard last year around DJU or a guy like Marvin Jones or Terrence Ferguson, Malik Benson. That's not a knock on the players that were on this roster last year. I guess the general take that I'm getting from Florida State is, look, we think we brought in some good football players in the portal, but we also think we brought in some better teammates. And we think the chemistry and cohesiveness on this roster is a little bit better than what it was in 2024. That's just the general vibe that I'm getting. Like every press conference I've listened to about Deuce Robinson or a guy like Luke Pettibon, I've been really, really impressed from what we're hearing from not only these individuals, but from the other players and coaches on this roster as well. Just a general take. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it. Would love to hear from the Florida State fans in the comment section. Want to get a little bit more nitty gritty now. Talk about the players that are starting to generate some buzz, what it means for Florida State in 2025. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Florida State fans. Buckle up. I think it's going to be really fun next couple of weeks talking this program. There is a lot to learn about this new coaching staff and this new roster throughout the next couple of weeks during fall camp. The amount of support's been amazing. We appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I want to be very clear. There's a lot of good that we're hearing from Florida State, a lot of things that really fire me up. I want to start with something that maybe I have a question mark about. Amari Williams back at tight end. And my concern is not him playing tight end. My concern is that this kid has stepped on campus as a reclassified dude. He should be a freshman right now. He's going into year 2, and he's kind of just bounced around, right? Freshman year was playing tight end. Spring practice was rushing the passer off the edge. Back in fall camp, now he's back playing tight end. And I know the plan is to play him on both sides of the football. My concern is that, are you just going to get an average player who's a tight end and jack? I look at Amari Williams and say that this kid's athletic profile, it's one of the best athletic profiles that you have on this roster, and there ain't no doubt about that. This kid is a legitimate freak in terms of the athleticism that he brings to the table. Not allowing him to settle in at one position, is that potentially a mistake? And I want to be very clear. Look, I'm in my basement in Rochester, New York. I am not privy to what's going on behind closed doors. The conversations Amari Williams is having with Mike Norvell and the other coaches on this staff. My only concern is that I look at this kid and say he is so talented, and it sounds like we might not be maximizing him because we're bouncing him around all over the football field. Now, I get you could point at Travis Hunter, who played both defensive back and wide receiver last year. My take there would be, look, there's a reason only one player has done that in the last 2 decades, and that's Travis Hunter. He was and Florida State fans know this, he's a one-of-one kind of guy. My biggest concern is that we're not maximizing what Amari Williams can be because we're bouncing him around different positions. I'm a Michigan fan. Michigan had a really, really good athlete named Amarian Walker from Louisiana. Comes to Michigan, starts out as a wide receiver, moves to defensive back year 2, goes back to wide receiver year 3, never really turned into a football player for Michigan because he just never really found a home. That's my concern with Amari Williams. Look, I'm not saying Mike Norvell is managing this wrong. That's just the concern that I have as an outsider looking into this program. would like them to pick a position for this kid and go let him dominate at that position. All right, some positives. Number one positive here, and this is maybe the most, at least in my opinion, maybe the most important storyline for Florida State. These freshmen could be special. I look at the freshman class, the guys that Florida State signed in the 2025 cycle, and say, we've seen so many classes just fall apart for Florida State. Like their hit rate on these kids at the high school ranks has been absolutely miserable under Mike Norvell. You got to love what you're hearing from these freshmen. It starts at quarterback Kevin Sperry, who, look, he ain't going to start this year, but you're hearing great things about Kevin Sperry. We kind of knew Usman Kroma was going to be that guy. He sounds to be that guy for Florida State since he's got on campus. There's not been a freshman across the country, maybe outside of Bryce Underwood, who has generated the buzz that Javon Boggs has generated at Florida State. I think they're really happy with Chase Lofton. Look, he might be a year away from being an impact guy. Really happy with what they have in Chase Lofton. Kevin Wynn, Shamar Arnaud on the other side of the football. For the first time in a long time, I'm looking at this freshman class for Florida State and saying, hey, it might have not been a top 10 class in the country, but it sounds like Florida State really likes what they have with some of these freshmen. And there's guys like Usman Kroma, Javon Boggs that have the opportunity to be year one massive impact guys for Florida State. And look, those are the two positions where you see guys have the highest impact, especially at wide receiver. And go look at not only Jeremiah Smith, but Ryan Williams. I mean, you look at the Clemson wide receivers and TJ Moore and Brian Wesco. If you're a freshman that can play at wide receiver, you're going to get on the football field and you're going to have that opportunity to be that guy. And Deuce Robinson, Javon Boggs, square away. That has the opportunity to sound like a really good starting three wide receivers for Florida State in 2025. You continue to hear all the right things about the freshmen that Florida State has brought in. Here's another big storyline that I think sneaky that we didn't really talk about in spring, but I think matters. This offensive line is healthy. Now, why is that so important? It's a brand new offensive line. Like I want these guys repping together throughout fall camp. And my biggest concern going back to spring was, look, Micah Pettis wasn't really practicing. Gunnar Hansen wasn't really practicing. I think there were times that Luke Pettibon was also missing some practices, dealing with some things. Now, I wasn't super concerned in spring because you look at Gunnar Hansen, you look at Micah Pettis, you look at Luke Pettibon. Look, there ain't many guys that have played more football than those three up front on the offensive line. So them missing spring practice, that's not the worst thing in the world. But at the end of the day, this is a brand new offensive line. Guys that have never played together before in their lives. Them healthy in fall camp, repping next to each other every single day. That's my biggest concern with Florida State's offensive line. My concern is not do we have good football players. Look, we have large sample sizes of all these guys saying they are solid football players up front. Was it all going to come together? Well, them all being healthy on the offensive line, getting reps together, that matters if you're a Florida State fan, especially when you look at that week one matchup against Alabama and say, we don't have time. We don't have time to figure it out on the fly. This thing has to come together quickly or else it's going to get ugly week one against Alabama. Defensive side of the football real quick. There's things I like and there's things that I still want to see answers from. The thing I like, this is a very deep defense. It sounds like, a lot of coaches use the term above the line. And above the line essentially meaning, are you a guy that we trust can go out and play football for us? This might be the defense that has the highest amount of players that are above the line that Mike Norvell has had. Now, Florida State's had some really good defenses, going back to 2023, guys like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk. Although that defense was really good, the depth wasn't always there. 2024 is a disaster. I don't even know if you had 11 guys that you trusted out there. Going into the 2025 year, it seems like this is about as deep of a defense that Florida State has had in a long time, maybe since 2023. Now, I love the depth. There's one thing I still got to figure out for Florida State, and that is, do we have the high upside guys? Like, who are the guys that are going to be top 50 NFL draft picks? Who are the guys that are going to win us football games in 2025? With the difference makers. I think you have one with Darrell Jackson, at least in my opinion. I think you might have one with a guy like Jeremiah Wilson, especially with his playmaking ability in the back end, forcing turnovers. You've heard great things about Earl Little Jr. Kind of have to see it before we believe it. That's what I'm looking for the most. Does anyone on this defense separate? and really become that first team all ACC caliber guy, top 50 NFL draft pick kind of guy. Because you go back and look at Florida State, what made that defense so dominant in 2023? You had legitimate dudes. You had guys that were going top 100, top 50 in the NFL draft. Does Florida State have enough of those guys in 2025? It's really my biggest concern for this defense as a whole, because I think it's a deeper team. It's going to be it's a better coach team than it was last year. Do we have enough of the high upside Jimmies and Joes? I think you're trying to figure that out during fall camp for Florida State. We know we got a few, Daryl Jackson, Jeremiah Wilson. How many more can we find? That's probably the question. Going to be a really fun fall camp. Position battles all over the place. A lot of young talent that see, like, if they string together good fall camps, we're going to see a lot of this young talent play for Florida State in 2025. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. A lot of storylines. You do have some position changes as well that we'll talk about throughout fall camp. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.